Maybe you've never said this out loud. Maybe not even to yourself. But there is a moment, almost imperceptible, when faith begins to shift inside us. You still believe in God. You still recognize the truth of the gospel. You still know intellectually what you believe. Yet something no longer holds the way it used to. Prayer becomes shorter. Scripture loses its weight. God's silence starts to trouble you more than it comforts you. And what makes it harder is that there is no clear culprit. You didn't abandon faith on purpose. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a slow erosion, a spiritual fatigue. The modern world doesn't steal faith through direct attacks. It does something more subtle. It exhausts us. It demands constant attention, constant productivity, constant opinions, reactions, responses. And in that endless noise, faith, which has always spoken in silence, begins to feel distant. You start to notice an uncomfortable gap between what you hear in church and what you live outside it, between spiritual promises and concrete reality, between the language of hope and the daily experience of frustration. And then a thought appears, difficult to admit. I still believe, but I don't trust the same way anymore. This is deeper than intellectual doubt. Intellectual doubt asks whether something is true. This crisis asks whether it is worth continuing. Is it worth believing in a world that seems indifferent to goodness? Is it worth obeying when obedience costs more than transgression? Is it worth waiting when everything around you rewards those who don't? Faith begins to be measured by exhaustion. And here a common, not theological, but human mistake appears, confusing faith with feeling. We learn, often without noticing, that real faith means feeling peace, certainty, enthusiasm, that healthy faith always feels reassuring, that strong faith never hesitates. But this is not biblical faith. It is an emotionalized version of it. Scripture never hides seasons of dryness. It never promises constant clarity. It never treats God's silence as absence. The Psalms are filled with unanswered questions. The prophets spoke to God without immediate replies. The disciples walked with Jesus and still did not understand what was happening. Christian faith has always lived with waiting. The problem is that the modern world does not tolerate waiting. It demands immediate results, immediate feelings, immediate validation. When that doesn't happen, faith starts to feel like failure. And then people begin to drift away, not out of rebellion, but out of shame. Shame for doubting, shame for feeling empty, shame for not feeling what they think they should feel. Faith rarely disappears all at once. It withdraws. It leaves the center and moves to the margins of life, to specific moments, to emergencies, to crises. It stops being a foundation and becomes a backup plan. This creates a deep inner conflict. You don't see yourself as an unbeliever, yet you no longer live as someone who fully trusts. Jesus never treated this condition with contempt. He never called it betrayal. He never pushed away those who were weak. On the contrary, he was harsher with the self-assured than with the weary, more direct with the confident religious than with the confused disciples. Because faith does not begin to die when questions appear. It begins to suffer when relationship is replaced by obligation, when prayer becomes a task, when belief becomes effort, when trust becomes a burden. At that point, the central question is no longer, what do I believe? It becomes, why should I continue? And that question is legitimate. not because faith is weak, but because humans are. Recognizing this does not diminish faith. It is often the first step towards placing it back where it belongs. Christian faith has never been sustained by human emotional strength. It has always been sustained by God's faithfulness, even when we are too tired to notice it. Faith does not begin to fade with rejection. It begins with exhaustion. And understanding this changes everything.
When faith begins to weaken, the problem is rarely God. He does not change. What changes is the environment in which faith is forced to survive. Christian faith was formed in a slow world, a world where silence existed, where waiting was part of life, where time was not constantly fragmented. The modern world is the opposite. It demands continuous attention, constant performance, and immediate answers. Everything must be measured. Everything must produce results. Even inner life is evaluated by efficiency. In this context, faith begins to feel unproductive. Prayer offers no immediate return. Trust provides no visible guarantees. Obedience often costs more than transgression. And so a quiet tension emerges. Faith requires surrender, while the world demands control. This tension wears people down. Gradually, the logic of the world is internalized. Spiritual life is measured by the same standards used for work, productivity, and social validation. If nothing is strongly felt, something must be wrong. If results are not immediate, failure is assumed. But faith was never designed to function that way. In the Christian tradition, faith is not a tool for producing emotional stability. It is a relationship of trust in the midst of uncertainty. Abraham believed without seeing. Moses obeyed without fully understanding. Many of the Psalms were written not from certainty, but from anguish. The New Testament does not present faith as comfortable. It presents it as sustaining. Faith does not remove the weight of reality. It prevents that weight from destroying us. The problem is that the modern world does not teach endurance. It teaches avoidance. When faith begins to require perseverance instead of immediate relief, it starts to feel like a burden. Not because faith has failed, but because our expectations have been shaped by a logic foreign to the gospel. Jesus never promised emotional stability. He promised presence. "I am with you always" is not a promise of constant comfort, but of faithful companionship. There is a crucial difference between faith and religious sensation. Sensations rise and fall. Faith remains, even when there is no internal confirmation. In many cases, what feels like losing faith is not abandoning truth. It is exhaustion from trying to sustain an idealized version of it, a faith that never doubts, a faith that never tires, a faith that never enters the desert. But the desert has always been part of the biblical path. It was in the desert that Israel learned dependence. It was in the desert that Jesus faced silence and temptation. It was in the desert that many saints discovered that God reveals himself not only through consolation, but through faithfulness. Faith does not disappear when the world becomes difficult. It is tested when the world offers easier alternatives. And here lies something essential. The modern world is not spiritually neutral. It forms habits. It shapes desires. It establishes priorities. Without noticing, life begins to function as if God were only one option among many, important but not central, true but not decisive. This fragmentation corrodes faith not through direct confrontation, but through dispersing. When God stops being the axis and becomes peripheral, life reorganizes itself around other logics: performance, comparison, emotional survival. And faith, deprived of space, weakens, not because it is false, but because it has been displaced. In this sense, losing faith is not about ceasing to believe in God. It is about losing trust that He sustains reality when it no longer makes sense. And that trust does not come from human effort. It comes from remembrance. Remembering who God is, remembering how He acts, remembering that Christian faith never promised the absence of crisis, only presence within it. Recognizing this is not spiritual defeat, it is honesty. And genuine faith always begins with honesty before God. When faith begins to fade, there is almost always a silent mistake happening first. Not rebellion, not a lack of character, but confusion. Many people begin to treat faith as something that must be felt all the time in order to be real. When the emotion disappears, they conclude that God has withdrawn. When prayer feels dry, they assume something is broken. But Christian faith was never sustained by constant spiritual sensation. It was sustained by faithfulness, even when everything felt empty. The mistake is confusing faith with interrupted spiritual experience. That creates a dangerous dependence. A person begins to believe in God only when they feel spiritually well. When exhaustion arrives, when life tightens its grip, when prayer turns into silence, faith appears to die. But what actually died was a false expectation. Scripture is clear. The absence of feeling is not the absence of God. Job felt nothing. David wrote psalms asking where God was. The disciples fell spiritually asleep while Jesus agonized. None of them were abandoned. They were being formed. Another common mistake is trying to fix a crisis of faith through sheer personal effort. More reading, more promises, more attempts to go back to how it was before. This only increases guilt, because faith is not spiritual performance. It is not something you force. It is not something you recover by pretending nothing has changed. Mature faith accepts that it moves through seasons, that there are periods of light and periods of night, and that God remains the same in both. There is also a deeper danger. When faith starts to weaken, many people isolate themselves. They stop talking about it. They stop praying honestly. They stop admitting they are tired. Silence does not bring you closer to God. It only increases the inner distance. In the Christian tradition, faith has always been lived in community, not because community solves everything, but because no one sustains faith alone for very long. Even the apostles needed one another. When faith begins to fail, the healthiest first move is not to pretend strength, but to admit weakness. God has never rejected those who approached Him with truth. He has rejected masks. There is something deeply liberating in saying, I believe, but I am weak. I trust, but I am tired. I am still here, even without answers. That is not losing faith. That is stopping the act. And only when faith stops being a role to perform can it become a living relationship again. Many spiritual crises do not demand new answers. They demand honesty. Honesty about the impossible pace we are living under. Honesty about the unrealistic expectations we place on ourselves. Honesty about the fact that faith was never meant to compete with the noise of the world without adjustment. Faith weakens when we try to carry it with the wrong hands. It was not meant to be held by anxiety, nor sustained by comparison, nor fed by constant urgency. It grows in slow trust, in imperfect consistency, in presence even without feeling, and recognizing that changes everything.
When faith begins to weaken, the most common question is, what do I need to do? But perhaps the most honest question is another one. What do I need to stop doing? Stop blaming yourself for feeling tired. Stop believing that real faith is always strong, always confident, always clear. Stop measuring your relationship with God only by your best days and ignoring the worst ones. Christian faith was never presented as the absence of doubt. It was always presented as remaining even with doubt. Most people don't lose their faith because they stop believing in God. They lose it because they try to carry faith alone, as if it were an individual burden and not a living relationship. The modern world demands too much speed, too many immediate answers, too many comparisons. And in that environment, faith doesn't disappear, it becomes exhausted. That's why the first step when you feel like you're losing faith is not to run, it's to slow down. Reduce the noise, reduce the spiritual self-pressure, reduce the need to understand everything right now. God does not require total clarity from you. He asks for presence. Faith doesn't grow when you try to prove something. It grows when you remain, even when you feel nothing extraordinary. There are moments when believing simply means not walking away, and that is already enough faith. Jesus never said following him would be easy. He said he would be present. Christian faith does not promise the absence of darkness. It promises companionship within it. If you feel tired, confused, spiritually dry, that does not mean God has moved away. It means you are human. And perhaps this is the most honest moment of your faith, not the weakest one. Because a faith that survives silence is deeper than a faith sustained only by emotion. In the end, what you need to do when you feel like you're losing faith is not to find perfect answers. It's to keep taking small steps, real ones, imperfect ones, and to trust that God walks with you even when you can barely walk with yourself. This is not spiritual failure. It is maturity.